let me just welcome everyone to what I hope will be the first of an annual alumni event. I'm really excited to see all of you. I'm excited that you all could be here tonight. All of you are here because you were involved in programming for the Center for Public Choice and Market Process at some point during your time at CFC. And I'm excited that you want to and continue to have the opportunity to be involved with us. We wish we could be in person and do something like that, and in the future we might, but it's also really nice that we could do this virtually so that people from all over could easily join us. So we've got people from all over the country joining us right now, which is kind of nice. And you know, we've got faculty on the line here. Dr. Maldonado is here. Dr. Walker said he'd be here, but it's Dr. Walker, so y'all draw your own conclusion about that. So Doug said he'd pop in. We'll see. And afterwards, we can have time to catch up and with them and me and whatever. I got to thank, though, this event is really the brainchild of a member of our advisory board and a colleague of Pete Boettke's, Virgil Storr, who some of you have met over the years, having him visit campus. And Virgil's idea was that we have alumni that through the center, we've got enough of them now. They were engaged in the ideas while they were here. So if we're going to do something, let's get an opportunity for them to be able to sort of continue those types of discussions. I'm very excited to have tonight's speaker with us. He's not actually been on campus, sadly, since 2011. So some of you probably never got a chance to see him speak in person. I'm going to date you here, Pete, for just a second, and myself, and that is, I was a senior undergrad. The first time I got to see a young assistant professor, Peter Boettke, speak on the transition and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you know, I'm been really fortunate in my career that Pete has become a friend and a colleague over the years, and we've been involved in many things together, organizations. His work on mainline and mainstream economics has inspired, you know, some of our reading groups. It inspired a theme for our Adam Smith Week a couple of years ago, as several of you know. And his work in general continues to inspire a lot of what I do. So let me introduce him to you. Peter Boettke is the university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, and the director of the Hayek program for the advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is the author of 14 books, if I counted correctly today, and a best-selling textbook, The Economic Way of Thinking, and he has more journal articles than I could begin to mention. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about his latest book and what I think is a constant theme for us here at the center is the struggle for a better world. So with that, I will turn it over to Pete.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate this opportunity and the attentiveness of your alumni who have come to discuss these ideas with me. Before we get started, I'm going to share my screen in a second. I think that one of the things that's so exciting about the program that Peter has put together at College of Charleston, which has been consistent, is these Adam Smith Weeks. And the opportunity that they have afforded to students at the College of Charleston for many years to be exposed to some really amazing minds across the disciplines in the social sciences and political economy. And I want to, you know, congratulate Peter on that and wish him nothing but the greatest of success in the post-pandemic era of returning to that kind of educational initiative and working with the students to have those opportunities. The second thing that I'm going to sort of talk about here before I share my screen is two things I want to mention is that this particular book is a set of essays that I've been given the chance to present at learned societies over from 2000 to 2020, roughly. And so it's presidential addresses, keynote lectures, and different things like that I got a chance to present and do it. And then I selected out of those, and then I have it bookended by a new introduction and a new conclusion, which tries to frame it in the discussion of the contemporary society. And I really do hope that the collection is a cohesive one for readers, and it has some compelling arguments in it. But like with everything, and I'll explain this in a second, with the struggle, these are all attempts to present conjectures in a bold way, but always subject to refutation and revision and different bites of the apple. So I'm looking forward to your engagement in it. The other thing I want to mention is that I'm not a rocket scientist. I do basic economics. And I really believe that you should do basic economics applied persistently and consistently. And that what happens with a lot of people is they stop applying economics persistently and consistently. Peter made mention of the difference between mainline and mainstream economics. I really want to draw a line from Adam Smith all the way up to Vernon Smith and ask what's the commonality in the way that these thinkers think, and contrast that with whatever is currently scientifically fashionable at a moment. Sometimes the main line is the mainstream. The main line of economics from Adam Smith to Vernon Smith is what the mainstream of economics about. But other times there's great deviations between that, and explaining that arc in intellectual history has been a major part of my own research program. But if I could summarize, a lot of times I summarize what mainline economics is. It's that you derive the invisible hand proposition from the self-interested, the invisible hand postulate from the invisible hand proposition from the self-interested postulate via institutions. But another way to think about it is that economists in general, when you push them, scratch them, they're going to argue that we live in a world of scarcity, and as a result of that, we face trade-offs. As the economist Thomas Sowell likes to put it, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. The second thing that economists will tend to stress is that incentives matter, okay? So trade-offs abound, incentives matter. And on the trade-off issue, going back to the first point about mainline versus mainstream, I think one of the things that's important to realize about from Adam Smith and all the way up to Vernon Smith is that we begin in a world of scarcity. Scarcity requires that we make choices, that we forego one path and pursue another path, which means that we have trade-offs, that we as imperfect human beings require aids to our mind to be able to negotiate the trade-offs. And within a commercial society, those aids come to us in the form of property, prices, and profit and loss. Property is going to prod us, prices are going to guide us, profits are going to lure us, and losses are going to discipline us, okay? If we are not in the world of a commercial society, let's say we're in the idea of a community, or if we're in government decision-making or public choice, right? It's public choice and market process. So, public choice arena, you're going to have to, by definition, find some other aid to the human mind other than property prices and profit and loss to help us negotiate the trade-offs that we're going to have to make. And part of the whole studying of comparative institutions, government versus markets versus community or nonprofits, is the exploration of what institutions substitute for property prices and profit and loss to be able to help us negotiate the trade-offs that we face. And that's one of the great insights that goes all the way back to Adam Smith and continues all the way to today. And one of classic examples is Adam Smith talking about the delivery of education services in Oxford versus in Glasgow, right? And the comparative institutions of that. In Oxford, the professors were paid out of an endowment. At Glasgow, they were paid by student fees. So Professor Nomicus behaved differently, not because Professor Nomicus was different, but the incentives that they faced were different. Therefore, they behaved differently, right? And so it's examining this comparative institutions that drives my understanding of when we embrace the idea of a struggle for a better world. So I just wanted to lay that out before we get started, just so that it makes somewhat of sense of what I'm trying to hang these arguments on. Okay, now, so let's get started. So what do I mean by the term struggle? In this book, what I mean by the term struggle is that I, as a scholar, Peter as a scholar, other professors that are here, or you as students or whatever, trying to figure stuff out. It's a great, lesson from the great physicist, Richard Feynman. It's called The Pleasure of, figuring things out, right? This is what we do as scholars, is that we're puzzling all the time about how we figure things out. But that's a struggle, because it's really hard to figure out in a complex world, how do I understand the human condition using the tools of economic reasoning, right? And so, these fundamental problems of poverty, of, growth and development, of how is it that Paris gets fed, or how is it that you're gonna, my teacher, Jim Buchanan, had a professor at University of Tennessee, and the guy used to say to him, economics will not tell you how to be rich or poor, but it will explain to you, why you're on the bread line or not, right? And so that has to do with your marginal productivity and the wage and these kind of things. So we're all puzzling, trying to figure out these problems. But it's also the case that as a citizen that's a member of society, one member of society, not privileged or anything like that, just another member of society, we need to struggle to find the institutional solutions that will fulfill the plan of equality, liberty, and justice. And that is a struggle. Liberty is born in the struggle for liberties, right? Each of the battles that have been won and hard fought throughout the history of humanity for us to have some elbow room and some freedom, and from recognition of our fundamental equality and justice in our interactions, those are hard fought, long and difficult battles. And so it's the play on both of those that I'm engaged in. And I already mentioned here, this is sort of the layout of these things. I've been very fortunate. I know that you're alumni, so you've probably all gone on to your own different careers. But, I was a kid that grew up I'm the first male of my family to graduate from college. Funny story on this is that when I was a freshman in college, my grandfather, who I was very close with, passed away. On his deathbed, he grabbed my hand and he told me, Peter, no matter what you do, please, graduate from college. And if you fast forward 8 years later, I'm about ready to defend my dissertation. My grandmother hasn't followed the whole thing that closely, but I'm home for Thanksgiving and she pulls me aside and she says, Peter, I know Pop told you to stay in college, but not forever. You can't be a professional student. You got to get a job at some point. I'm like, I know, Nana, I know, like that. But, of course, that's what I ended up by being. It's the college professor is just nothing more than a professional student for their whole life. But I've had a tremendous good fortune in my career. So these essays include lectures that I've given all over the world, from New Zealand to Argentina to Moscow to all over the place. So I've been very, very fortunate in that, and I highly recommend being a professor's life. It's a good life. So there's a good book. There's a book out by Jason Brennan, who maybe, have you had him down, Peter? I don't know if you have, but but Jason Brennan has a new book out about being a professor, and it's called Good Work If You Can Get It. And it is a real good work if you can get
He's
it.
on my list. I'll have to.
Yeah. I recommend you read this book, by the way. So what is liberalism all about? Liberalism has to be understood as an emancipation project. What I was saying before about the freeing us from the oppression is hard-won battle for individual liberties. And each one of these is a serious moment in history. It's an emancipation project. It's emancipation from the dogma of the altar, from the subjugation of the crown, from the violence of the sword, from the bondage of slavery, from the drudgery and the poverty of the plow. And most importantly for you guys, because you've been through the Adam Smith week, it's from the exploitation of the mercantilist class. It is a very important point to always remember that Adam Smith was arguing against the mercantilist interest. He wasn't arguing against socialism, because socialism wasn't a doctrine. He was arguing against crony capitalism. That's what the system was at the time. The government was granting privileges to businesses. And so Adam Smith's not pro-business, he's pro-markets. It's a difference. And the concern that Smith has was one over the emancipation from the drudgery of poverty and the exploitation of individuals by those in positions of privilege. And so this is from The Wealth of Nations. No society can surely flourish and be happy, which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Okay, so economists never were about defending the power and privilege of the fortunate. It was always about a means and ends argument. Give ends as given, the striving for equality, liberty, and justice. What means are most effective at obtaining those ends? And so the economic criticism of a lot of policies is that those means are not going to achieve the end sought. If you could demonstrate that the means chosen can achieve the end sought, then the economist doesn't have anything to criticize, right? So if you said to me, raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour will eradicate the poverty of the underclass, okay? The economists as such would have no criticism of that argument, because they agree with the end, which is the eradication of poverty, ignorance, squalor, disease, idleness, all of these kind of 5 giants of social problems. But the question is whether or not the means chosen are effective with respect to the ends given. And so going back to the title of the center, what the center studies and what those terms mean is an examination of the public choices that are made to address those social ills and the incentive effects that are baked into the various different institutional structures of public choosers. So if you think about public choice, you have voter preferences, machination of politics, policy outcome. If voter preferences generated a policy outcome which was identical to each other, there'd be no examination of the machinations of politics, because it was just a pass-through. Voter preferences pass through, become policy outcomes. But it's precisely because there's a disjoint between the voter preferences and the policy outcomes that we have to examine the incentives of the machinations of politics to explain why that pattern results. Similarly, with market processes, both in terms of the benevolent side, which is individuals pursuing their self-interest, generating an outcome which is greater than the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's spontaneous order, invisible hand. Or the path to hell is paved with good intentions. I try to increase the minimum wage, and it causes disemployment effects. or I try to lower the rent and provide, more housing, but I end up by causing, a shortage of available units or deterioration in the quality of the units. And these arguments, it's a means end, so it's not a normative argument. And so the economists have always been that the most effective way to both minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing. And we have to do that against the constraint of nature, which is the issue of scarcity and trade-offs. We have to do it in a way that coordinates the distant and disparate individuals. So again, going back to Adam Smith, think about Adam Smith's discussion of the common woolen coat and the production of the common woolen coat that he lays out in the first, couple chapters of The Wealth of Nations. All right, he asks the question, how does a common woolen coat end up on the back of a day laborer? And then he goes through and explains the great multitude of exchanges that are required to produce just that homely product, as he puts it. But then there's also the issue that in this production of productive specialization, we also rely on the mutual beneficial exchange of people that we'll never know and never get to know. And this is, he lays out in the famous butcher, baker, and brewer passage. If you read what leads right up to that, the beginning passage of that is that scarce in our lifetime will we have the opportunity to make but a few close personal friends, but we require the cooperation of great multitudes for our daily survival. So how is that made possible? And that's made possible by the institutions of the liberal society, by the, as Hume put it, the respect for property, contract, and consent, or the way I've been pushing it here, property, prices, and profit and loss. And then finally, how do I do this in a way that raises the welfare for the least advantaged? That is, provides peace and prosperity that's generally recognized. And as I say here, it's important to stress that systematic economic science in Adam Smith was a critique of the privileged system of mercantilism, and that the birth of economic liberalism is in the same vein as the birth of political liberalism, the eradication of obstacles created by power and privilege. All right, and so it's this idea of enabling the rise of commercial society to lift humanity from the misery of poverty and subjugation by unchecked authority. All right, so this is Smith's plan, liberal plan for liberty, equality, and justice. Probably the best voice for Smith's plan at the moment is Deirdre McCloskey. So Deirdre McCloskey has a wonderful book that was published by Yale right as the COVID-19 hit us, and it's called Why Liberalism Works. It's a very short, easy reading book. Her big manifesto, the trilogy, is a great work, and a summary of that with a colleague of Peter and I's, Art Carden, is a very nice read too. So, but McCloskey would be the most modern voice, I think, for Smith's liberal plan. But I want to push things that, Peter mentioned early that I spent the first decade or more of my career writing about the Soviet socialist experiment and the transition from socialist economies. That's how I earned my living as an economist. My first book, I've written 3 books on this, and I've traveled all throughout. I still teach over in Eastern Europe every year. But in these essays in this book, that's largely absent from the book. Those are in other books that I have, but it's never really absent because it's always the thing that frames. So, Professor Calcagno can tell you, it's not too long in public choice where you go from studying about voting rules to where you're also thinking about things like the paradox of revolution and other kinds of transition issues and everything like that, which put politics at the center, and try and analyze that. And that was true for my teachers. That's true for my own work as well. And so I tend to think about this continuing emancipation from oppression due to power and privilege. And I want to see these things in terms of that each and every one of these massive movements that we've seen since 1989, collapse of communism, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or the Rose Revolution in Georgia, These are all kinds of examples of this, but so is the Arab Spring, and also the expansion of LGBTQ rights and the battle over those, including single-sex marriages, but also Black Lives Matter and the issues having to do with the criminal justice system and whatnot. Each and every one of these is a continuing struggle. Now, what's important to realize is that they don't, just because they're a struggle doesn't mean they win. Sometimes they lose, and that's part of the whole issue of the struggle. So it's a long and onerous process to continue to struggle. This picture is from the Berlin Wall in 1989. And if you look at that, you see, jubilation and agreement. You guys are all too young for this. Peter's not, but all of you that are here are too young for this. And so it's very difficult for you to wrap your head around how much enthusiasm was exhibited by people in the former communist countries for the ability to open up and have freedom. And then how disappointed they were in the 1990s as the struggle continued on and it became more and more difficult to see the outcome of that. And so you have various different things. No one could have predicted in 1989 that you would have someone like Viktor Orban rise up in Hungary, or that you would have populist governments in the Czech Republic. If you're close to these kind of issues, you have to remember is that the Czech Republic, my God, they had Václav Havel, the poet laureate, right? In many ways, the person with the most moral authority of any post-communist leader. And 25 years later, they're, immersed in corruption charges and a populist, right-wing movement that wants to shut things down and everything like that. So it's an ongoing and very, difficult and onerous process of this struggle for liberty, equality, and justice. And that goes back to, trying to figure this out. So again, this is to invoke Adam Smith here. What am I trying to make an argument in my book is that I want to develop a robust political economy that follows in the line from Adam Smith. And so this is a quote from F.A. Hayek, the modern practitioner and student of Adam Smith. And he tries to get across this idea of the institutional robustness of Smith's system, which was that bad men can do least harm, not that the best and the brightest could do great if we just gave them freedom. If we just gave them power. And so in some sense, the whole message of the book could be summed up in that if you give the argument for liberalism is that if you allow ordinary people freedom, they can do extraordinary things. Whereas the progressive agenda was if you identify extraordinary people and give them power, they can achieve extraordinary things. Okay? And we've just seen this battle in many ways just play out in the modern stage. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they've been given the elbow room to do it. Or do we trust our fate in extraordinary people who have been trained at elite institutions to be able to rule or over us? In the Ostrom language, this is a difference between governing with versus governing over. And a lot of the progressive agenda is to govern over its population, not govern with the population. And I talk about, there's several different bites of the apple in the book where I go through and try to work through this. The other aspect that I try to do in the book is to follow what I would call an intellectually robust argument. So the easiest way to understand this is you always have to follow Daniel Dennett's rules of engagement, which is that you learn how to criticize with kindness. So if you don't know anything, never heard of that, look it up on Google or whatever, Daniel Dennett's rules of intellectual engagement. And I try to square that with economics by the idea of treating the ends as given. So in the book, I don't ever try to question any of the ends. of the people that I'm engaged with, I just limit my analysis to the means to obtain the ends, rather than the idea of over the ends itself. And what I do is I try to, not that I'm always successful, but I try to make the arguments in such a way that I give the best case to my intellectual adversaries, and at the same time give the worst case to my own position. So if my position can work in the least likely of circumstances for it to work, that's a robust argument, especially if I grant very favorable conditions to my intellectual opponents and their argument doesn't work. So that's the sort of strategy, at least intellectually, in theory. I don't always survive that test as I would like. So I wanted to, this isn't in the book, it's in the introductions and the conclusions, but it's not really spelled out in the book. But the pandemic gives us a very useful kind of way to do it, as does the current issues having to do with racial injustice. So I have a paper coming out in the Georgetown Law Review, which is on COVID and liberalism. And I try to run the thought experiment from John Stuart Mill's harm principle about whether or not you can imagine a liberal society which could, as Mill refers to it, discipline actions that are prejudicial to the actions of others. That is, my actions cause externalities on you. Can we find a way in which liberalism could deal with that? And what I want to say is that that is a test of the liberal theory. That's a test of the theory. It says, can your theory handle this big, hairy problem? If your theory can't handle the big, hairy problem, we might have to suspend it for the minute, and then we get it back, which is what the argument has been, right? The global financial crisis hits. We have to suspend normal operations of capitalism in order to do what? Save capitalism. That was the claim that was made, right? And similarly, today, we had to suspend various different issues of liberal order in order to be able to then have the liberal order after the pandemic is done. So what I'm trying to get you to think about there is just do some thought experiments. Think creatively and about how it is that maybe a liberal society might have done things. Do the counterfactual. How might we have done what we did differently than what we did? But there's also the problem of the challenge to liberalism. And that is, I leverage in the beginning of the book a famous essay by Frederick Douglass called "What is a Slave? What is the 4th of July to a Slave?" And I recommend it to everyone to read. It's a very, very powerful address. For those of you who have a libertarian bent, you should note that in that essay, Douglass refers to Lysander Spooner as the person that influenced him in being able to think about this. And a lot of people miss that history through time. So they think of Frederick Douglass but Frederick Douglass is very much in the libertarian vein. But if you read what he argues in that, the claim is that your theory is hollow in its promises. But that's really not what Douglass argues. I argue in here. What I argue is that what Douglass is saying is that you did not apply consistently your theory. If you applied your theory consistently, you would recognize me. And therefore, the 4th of July would be something that we could all celebrate together. All right, because slavery would be abolished and you would treat me as a dignified equal. And so in both of these ideas, liberalism tested, liberalism challenged, I try to make an argument in the introduction and the conclusion and throughout many of the essays that you have these principles of Mill's harm principle and polycentricism. Polycentricism means overlapping and competing functional jurisdictions. So in some sense, think about this in terms of really true competitive federalism, right? That federalism is checkmating, the ability for you to vote with your feet, do feet voting, right? You don't like where this place lives, you vote with another place, you go there. And that's a principle of polycentricism. That allows your theory to handle these sort of tested notions. And insisting on the norms of that we are one another's dignified equals and the values of a cosmopolitan liberal order, those are going to be the answer to the idea of the challenge of liberalism. So the challenge to liberalism is not to abandon liberalism, but to fulfill liberalism, to actually fulfill what the revolutionary promise of liberalism was. Now, at least that's the argument I'm trying to give. Now, for those of you who have a kind of, liberal libertarian bent or whatever, I think it's important to realize that this is a thinking problem, not a marketing problem, right? That is that people of this persuasion that are trying to think through these tests and these challenges have to put their thinking cap on, not put their marketing cap on. It's not that you have to be slicker videos or, more entertaining or whatever. What you have to do is think about the hard problems and think about them in a consistent and persistent way and come up with creative and clever solutions to those problems. And at the moment, that hasn't happened. And I'm going to try to explain what I think is going on with that right now. So I lead my book with this quote from Hayek. You don't have to, I gave Peter the slides. If any of you want the slides, you can have them. The book, by the way, is available on Amazon in, Kindle version, softback version, and hardback version. The Kindle version's under $10, so it's relatively inexpensive. But the main idea here is this notion of tacit presuppositions. This is a concept that Hayek had and James Buchanan had. And it's basically what we treat as given without ever questioning it. Okay. And the problem is that the tacit presuppositions have changed since 1989. So I give an example in the book of, I was at a conference at Princeton that was honoring P.T. Bauer. P.T. Bauer was a great development economist. He taught at the London School of Economics, but he also, before that, taught at Cambridge. It turned out, by the way, that when he was at Cambridge, one of his star tutorial students was Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen is actually one of the people giving the tribute to P.T. Bauer at this conference. So he was asked to explain how come in 1964, P.T. Bauer was treated with such disdain for his views about development economics, where in 2004, which is when this conference took place, he was being revered at Princeton University as a champion of the right way to approach development economics. And Sen had a really interesting thing. He said, look, in 1964, everyone believed that markets were a zero-sum game and that politics is what provided hope. In 2004, Sen argues, the positions had reversed. At that time, everyone saw markets as the vehicle for generating positive-sum games and politics as zero-sum games. Now, Sen is older than you, and he witnessed all of that. But what he missed was that at the very time he was making that statement, the tacit presuppositions were reshifting again. And they were reshifting after 1989. So you have to think about what happened after 1989. Great euphoria. That's the heyday of the tacit presupposition saying government is the source of our conflicts. Markets are going to be the source of our liberation. That was the adopted position, not only in East and Central Europe, but also the position in the Scandinavian Nordic countries. Go back and look at what the Nordic countries did in 1990, 1991, 1992. Go right today and look up in 2019, not because of COVID, but the year before COVID, look at the economic freedom score of Norway versus the economic freedom score of the United States. Norway scores higher on economic freedom, right? And that's also going to be true for Denmark, Sweden, all these places. The president of Denmark told Bernie Sanders he can no longer keep quoting us. Stop it. We're not what you think we are, right? We're a different kind of thing. And you can see it in the economic freedom indexes. So if you go to freetheworld.com and just plug in the names, you can track over time and look at what happened to these countries during the 1990s. But Eastern Central Europe kept on running into all kinds of problems. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. At the same time, we started to have anti-globalization protests in the late 1990s. You have the anti-globalization protests, and then you get hit with 9/11. And so now all of a sudden, the world of these tacit presuppositions are shifting. Now, why did that happen? My hypothesis is that after 1989, people on the liberal side of the equation in politics and in economics, liberal meaning here, not the progressives, but the classical liberals, they thought that they had won the battle of ideas. And so as a result, they ceded the cultural ground because they thought it was all about politics. And they forgot that politics is downstream from culture. And when you give up the culture, you give up the future. So this picture up here is street art. All right, and I want you to look at it. It's a famous piece of street art, and it says, "Help! This economy is killing us." That was a street art that emerged after the financial crisis in 2008. Okay, so just think about your lifetime. What's the world that you've seen? Right, 9/11. The United States, you're too young probably even to remember 9/11, but all you know is that the United States has been in a perpetual war. So we have a wartime economy. Second, you've seen that you lived through the financial crisis. Most of you probably were teenagers when the financial crisis happened. And so what have you seen from that? You've seen, people that are disadvantaged became more disadvantaged. And you've seen people that were wealthy become wealthier because they got benefits. We were able to gamble with other people's money. Go back to my earlier statement before I even showed any slides, and I said basic economics. When I'm teaching, I say to students oftentimes, I said, hey, look, I'm going to take you to Vegas this weekend. And, I say Peter's a student in my class. I say, Peter, I'm going to take you to Vegas this weekend, but here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make sure that any losses that you make, I'll cover. But all the profits you get to keep. Are you going to be at the roulette wheel, or are you going to be at the slot machines? Right? Peter's going to be at the roulette wheel, and he's going to be highly leveraged. And so he admits that. I've never had a student tell me they wanted to go to slot machines when I'm taking care of their losses and they get to keep all their profits. And so when they tell me that, I say, oh, I didn't know your name was Goldman Sachs. Because the reality is that's the world that Goldman Sachs operated under. We privatized their profits, socialized their losses, and it was completely rational for them to leverage up the wazoo. Okay, and so that explains a large part of the preconditions. Now, the direction and all that stuff, it gets complicated, the story, but the basic idea that people leverage, it wasn't that they woke up in 2005 and said, let's drink some, crazy juice, and I engage in irrational investments. The investments that they engaged in were rational given the rules under which they were operating. And so the problem is the rules. And so we need to actually get back to the idea of understanding what our culture is about, what the ideas in the culture, and not have the complacency and lack of creativity among liberal thinkers. It's what Hayek refers to as, we must have, once again, a notion of a liberal utopia. So what's the task for liberal political economists today? So what's the lesson here? The lesson is to learn from Milton Friedman, which is the ability to think and communicate with clarity and compassion to your peers, to your students, and to the general public. Milton Friedman, more than any other intellectual of the 20th century, had the ability to communicate to his scientific peers, to the students in his classroom, and to the general public with a power that was unmatched. Okay, that's, even if I'm not completely, I'm not a monetarist, I'm not a Friedmanite or whatever. The reality is you have to recognize this was a unique talent. John Kenneth Galbraith, who's the closest wordsmith to Friedman, never could talk to his peers, right? He never could talk to his peers at the level that Friedman did. That's why he didn't win the Nobel Prize. All right. Keynes, for example, is another one. Keynes was able to talk to the general public. Keynes was able to talk to his peers, but Keynes himself, doesn't have a record as much as being a great teacher. What he was a great peer to his other professor friends. So, that's what you hear about at the Cambridge Circus. It's not their students, it's the Cambridge Circus, Joan Robinson, Richard Kahn, all these people like that. Friedman has this amazing ability. When I was in graduate school, when I was your age, there was a t-shirt and it had a little picture of Milton Friedman's head, all right? And it said, with this equation, which was the monetary equation of exchange, with this equation, I conquered. And it's really hard. Peter can understand this, but it's hard for you to understand it. When Milton Friedman overturned the Keynesian consensus, he literally was a one-man show. Because Hayek, who's another major rival of Keynes, he had left the building, right? He wasn't the guy that was doing this anymore, but Friedman pulled that off. It's an amazing accomplishment. I suggest that you learn from Buchanan and challenge the elitist presuppositions and caution fellow economists to cease pro-offering advice to policy experts as if they were offering it to a benevolent despot, understand the incentives involved in the machination of politics, and learn from Hayek, excite the minds of the next generation of thinkers, instill a sense of awe about the market order and a sense of purpose to the practice of economic science. And then finally, from Adam Smith, and I have him in bold letters here, I want to suggest that if you read Adam Smith and you read the prose in which he took care to communicate with, you see a man of tremendous kindness and generosity of spirit. That's contained in the theory of moral sentiments. And he also possessed analytical acuteness and historical judgment. And that's in The Wealth of Nations. And so rather than splitting Smith's TMS and The Wealth of Nations, we need to see these as joint productions of the Smithian project in political economy. And I think that project can capture our imagination going forward. So I have a final note, which is just as what really, so you went through this program, you studied economics, you've tried to process economics now in a postgraduate period or whatever. And I want to come back and sort of just suggest to you that there is something really important to remember about what economics teaches. It's 4 pillars that economics is grounded in. And those 4 pillars are, the first thing is economics provides truth and light. The laws of economics are just like the laws of gravity in physics, okay? Right? If I drop this pen, it's going to fall, all right? And I can study that. And the law of demand has the same ontological status as the law of gravity. Scarcity and trade-offs, incentives all the way down. Thinking consistently and persistently about that is a mind quake to somebody, okay? The other thing about economics, though, is that in studying the complex coordination of a market order and the interdependency of relationships, how a revolution in Chile could cause a rise in the copper price in New York City on the stock exchange, or any of these kind of complex, adaptive realities of the interconnected web of economic relationships. There's something beautiful in that. There's a great physics experiment that you can watch on YouTube, and it's a pendulum, and they fill the pendulum with sand, white sand, and then they put it over a blackboard, and then they let the pendulum swing. And as the pendulum settles into its equilibrium, it builds this beautiful picture. It doesn't just randomly go all over. right? It actually goes, and it can be repeated again and again. You can do it with paint, you can do it with whatever. It's the same picture. It's this beautiful picture. I again recommend that, looking up that kind of the beautiful interconnected matrix of social relations that is made up of the great society of the division of labor, social cooperation and division of labor. That's his awe and the beauty. That's the Paris gets fed. That's the, Russ Roberts, who I'm sure that Peter's had down there, has a little video called A Beautiful Loaf. And it's about, it's a video that you can watch about a bakery, satisfying commercial demands. And it plays off this theme. The third pillar of economics is hope. That as Jim Buchanan, my professor, used to say all the time, to say a situation is hopeless is to say it's ideal. Okay? Since we look out the window and it looks like the world isn't ideal, it must not be hopeless. So what is the great fact of history is that through entrepreneurship, through change, through entrepreneurship and institutional innovation that enables individuals to pursue productive specialization and realize peaceful social cooperation, we can in fact improve the human condition manifold. It's what the economist Angus Deaton refers to as the great escape. We're not trapped in the Malthusian trap. We instead have a 300-fold increase in our standard of living. Again, McCloskey's hockey stick. She sometimes on a stage will walk across the stage and she goes, like that, and it explains this great inflection point where it's like shoots up, and it's a non-scalar. It's not like I just put in more inputs and I get more outputs. It's like this non-scalar activity that explains the great fact. Where did that come from? That comes from this hope that's provided through the technological innovation, through the entrepreneurial innovation, through institutional innovation. And so economics teaches us to look at that. And then final idea goes back to the point that I raised about Adam Smith, is that economics has never been about how to improve the best or the most advantaged or the most privileged, but instead to improve the welfare of the least advantaged and eradicate the privileges through the power of the market rather than the centralized power of politics. And those are the 4 lessons of economics that I hope every time I teach economics, I communicate to students and to the public and to my peers who sometimes forget this. And I hope that in this book, I get those messages across as well. All right, so I appreciate you having the patience to listen to me through this, and I am glad to take any questions or challenges or whatever you would like. I see there's chat. I don't know if